All right, so this going to open this document, the week 7 demo lab, as well as the syntax document. And you'll see that the first things they do is tell you to open up the GSS 2022 dataset and codebook, and then our new syntax file for the week. These dataset and codebooks, the same thing that you used last week and the week before, etc. The syntax file again is different. So I'm gonna have this actually in two different recordings. The first one's gonna be the two sample t-test, and then I'll do a separate one with ANOVA. So a two sample t-test, we're gonna be comparing means. And so we're gonna use theism again. So again, that's this. Why don't I just put it in here so we can have, I'll put it in a separate document for now. And it says, what two groups will you compare? Name the variable and the two categories you will use as well as their codes. So if I'm looking through my code book, I have a couple options here. One option is to choose an indicator variable, which then I would use like 0 and 1. So for example, I could use this one and I could say, okay, Democrat versus not Democrat, right? I could also use one that is many categories, and I could choose two categories. So I could compare like extremely liberal to extremely conservative, or I could compare slightly liberal to slightly conservative. So it depends what you want to compare in terms of, for this, we're looking at like two different groups and how their theism levels compare. So why don't we take the race non-Hispanic Black indicator, which is 0 is not non-Hispanic Black only, and 1 is non-Hispanic Black only. So the not non-Hispanic Black only means it could be white, other, Hispanic, or multi, right? And then why don't we also just do one other one so I can show you how it works when we're picking categories. So why don't we do this region one? And I'm going to choose, let's see, the region that we're in, which is East North Central. And I'm going to choose, how about we do the one that Missouri is in, West North Central. So again, you're only choosing two categories to compare. The other thing I might want to do here, I don't really need to do it for this, but if I had one where, let's say I did this, for example, like how many sex partners has the respondent had in the last 5 years? Before I say, okay, I want to compare people who had no partners, people who've had more than 100, I might want to run a frequency table to make sure there's enough people for a comparison. Because if I'm going to be doing inferential statistics and looking not just at the sample, but thinking about all US adults, if I only have a few people in a category, it's really hard to make good generalizations from that. And so I'm gonna, for our purposes, I'm not gonna choose a category that has fewer than 30 respondents. So if I look at partners 5, I might just open the syntax. I might just make a frequency table of partners 5 just to see how many people are in each category. And I can see, okay, here there's only 7, so I'm not going to use that. In fact, I'm not going to use this one either, but any of these other ones would be fine. So if you're not confident about whether the category you're interested in whether it has enough people, you can run a frequency table just to see how many people are in that category. Okay, so we have two different ones. Again, you'll need one. I'm just showing you two examples. And we're going to use theism, but also I can go through and show you this with hours worked last week as well. Okay, so let's just focus though on this one for answering, and then I'll just show you the other as we go. Write a research question that your two sample t-test can answer. So I'm asking about, again, the difference, whether there's a difference between these groups in terms of their level of theism, their theistic beliefs. So do non-Hispanic Black only, meaning they're not multiracial, like so not non-Hispanic Black and another race. Um, U.S. adults and U.S. adults of a different race have the same or different beliefs in terms of theism. Okay. If I were to do this for this, I would say, right, do U.S. adults from the East North Central versus the West North Central have different theistic beliefs? If I were to do this with hours worked last week, I would say, right, do these groups have a different number of hours they worked last week? Or I can even ask something that the test itself can't answer, but through confidence intervals and other stuff that's part of that test, I could figure out, which is, I could say, do non-Hispanic Black only U.S. adults have higher theistic beliefs than other racial groups? Or do folks in the East, North, Central work on average more hours than folks in the West, North, Central last? So I'm going to add on average, right? Because we're looking at the means. We're not looking at the full distributions. We're just looking at their means. Okay, so my null hypothesis is always that there's no relationship. And so for that means that the means are the same, right? That basically whatever the theistic belief is, right? Let's say it was a 4 for one group, it's also a 4 for the other. Again, in the sample, it might be different, but we're saying when we look at those kind of confidence intervals for that, like we looked at last week, we're saying that they would overlap, meaning they could be the same. So this would be that my null hypothesis my null hypothesis then is going to be that they have the same means. So non-Hispanic null hypothesis, non-Hispanic Black only U.S. adults and U.S. adults of a different race have the same mean theism value, have the same, or beliefs or whatever you want to say. If I look here, again, I could also right, the null hypothesis is that the mean for non-Hispanic Black only equals the mean for other race. This. So you can choose kind of how you write this, but this is what the null is. And then my alternative hypothesis is that there is a relationship, right? That the means are different, meaning that non-Hispanic Black only, we're over 95% confident that non-Hispanic Black only U.S. adults have a different level of theism on average than folks that are in a different category, racial category. And so that would be, similar to this. Alternative is that instead of the same mean, they have a different mean value. Or again, here, that they're not equal. Okay. Again, if I was doing this for any of the others, it could be like for this one, if I did that with hours worked last week, it would be that the null would be that U.S. adults from the East North Central worked on average the same number of hours last week as folks from the West North Central region. And the alternative would be that they had different means, population means, right? That they worked a different number of average hours. Okay, using SPSS, turn on weighting, and then run a 2-sample t-test. Share your syntax and output. So I'm going to make sure that my syntax commands show up in the log. I'm going to turn on weighting. I remember that my weight variable in this data set is called weight variable. I could look that up in the code book if I wasn't sure. And then here's my two sample t-test. So it says, put your feelings thermometer variable. Oops, sorry. This is your dependent variable. So I'll change that, your construct. Where it says test variable name. So this is where theism is going to go. And then our group variable, remember we're using for our group, what did we say? We're using race NH black indicator. And then I have to specify here the codes. So which two groups I'm comparing. And so it's 0 and 1 are the two groups. So those replace the number signs. And then I click play. I'll just show you how to run this with the others. So if I wanted to do drop-down menus, again, first I would make sure that my syntax is going to show up. So edit, options, viewer, make sure this is checked and click OK. Data, weight cases, find my weight variable, put it in here, click OK. And then for this one, I'm going to go analyze, compare means and proportions. And I'm doing the independent samples t-test. That's the two sample t-test here. And then my test variable, that's where theism would go. And then my grouping variable, that's where the race non-Hispanic black indicator would go. And then I have to click this define groups and say, okay, the codes I want are 0 and 1. Those are the two groups I want. That's all fine. Okay. So I'm going to take my syntax and put it in. And I'm going to take my output and put it in. Can't quite fit it. There we go. What I don't want you to get confused about in this, sometimes people try and compare the first and second row, which is not correct. These are just two different tests. One where equal variance is assumed. There's a lot of assumptions that go into different tests, and one where they're not assumed. So you can just use this bottom row if you want. And if that's the case, you can even delete that top row so you don't get confused here. And so I could just look at this. You can also use the bottom row. I mean, you can also evaluate whether to use the top or bottom row. And I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But you're welcome to just use this one that has less assumptions. That one will always work. This one, you either have to have similar sample sizes or you have to have similar variances. So I can show you about that later, but you're welcome to just use the bottom row and you can even cut it out if you want to. While we're here, why don't I also just run the others that we were going to look at. And so that was going to be the region 16 one. So that's still theism, but instead for my grouping variable, I'm using region. And then here, instead of 0 and 1, if I did 0 and 1, that would do foreign and New England. But I wanted to compare East and North Central, which was 3 and 4. And so I'm going to put 3 and 4 as my two codes or groups in, and that'll give me that. And then let's also just do this with hours worked last week. And we can also do that with the race one. Okay. So let's go to number 4. It says, what are the sample means for your two groups and how do they compare? What does this mean in real life context? As part of your explanation, if the means are different, make sure to specify which the direction or like how far apart they are and like whether it's a big difference or not, as well as like which it has more theistic beliefs or not. So which one is more believing in God versus not. So this is not actually part of the t-test. This is basically just sample descriptive statistics like we've run before. But we've asked SPSS is producing these for us, which is useful. So if you look at the top of the t-test, right here we have information about these two variables. So there were 2,037 respondents weighted that were not non-Hispanic Black only, and 243 who were non-Hispanic Black only. And then we have their means and their standard deviations here. And so it's asking about the sample means, and that's these. So among these respondents, right, the mean for not non-Hispanic Black only was 4.59, and the mean for non-Hispanic Black only was 5.42. Okay, so I mean, I could literally calculate and tell you how different they are, but I can tell you they're just a little bit under a 1 unit apart. Again, if we go back to this, the non-Hispanic Black only is between a 5 and a 6. So non-Hispanic Black only has higher theistic beliefs, whereas than the not non-Hispanic Black only. Let's say respondents on average. So the not non-Hispanic Black only are between 4 and 5. So between believing sometimes and believing with doubts, whereas the non-Hispanic Black only on average are between believing with doubts and believing without doubts. So I'm going to say they both lean towards believing God, right? They're both here. It's not like one's down here and one's up there. But the non-Hispanic Black only respondents on average are more likely to consistently believe in God. If we were to look at our other ones here, we could see, let's see, here's region. So we can see these are pretty close. The West North Central is a little bit more theistic than East North Central, but you can see that this is less than 0.2 different. So again, one's like halfway between and one's like 3/4 of the way from 4 to 5. So those are different, but they're even much more similar. Both are between sometimes believing and believing with doubts. With West North Central a little less likely on average to be at the sometimes, right? They're closer to believing with doubts. And then if we look at hours worked, we can see West North Central is about less than 1 3/4, but like over 1.5 more hours on average worked per week than East North Central. And we can also see that non-Hispanic Black only are about 5, 7, 6, 7, about 3/4 of an hour more on average numbers of work hours worked last week. Okay, so that's comparing the sample means. All right, let's see what's next. What is your p-value? What does this mean in regards to your null and alternative hypothesis? And then is there a statistically significant difference? And then we're going to justify that with our p-value and explain what our p-value means in a real life context. So again, this is where I said there's these two different ones. You can see here actually the p-values are the exact same. And in fact, these are a little bit different, but not that different. But the p-values are the same. So for the p-value one, it doesn't really matter which row you're using. However, let's look at this. So here it says that you have two options. So if you have similar sample sizes for the two groups, let's see, we have 2,000 and like 200. So those are not similar. Or if the sig p-value in the first row under Levine's test is 0.05 or more. So that would be looking at this first test right here. If this one was 0.05 or more, you can use the first row. So we don't have either of those conditions, so we have to use the second row. It says if you do not have similar sample sizes, and the p-value, sorry, I can use and the p-value is less than 0.05, I have to use the second row. So we're not confident that the variances are equal. they could be different, and so we're using the second row. But again, for this one, for the p-values, it's not going to matter. But if you were to evaluate it here, we do have to use the second row. Okay, so let's see. So my p-value is less than 0.001. It's never going to be zero. Even if it shows up and it looks like it's zero, if you were to double click on this, well, this was a bad example. Sorry, let me go to a different one. Here. You can see that this number, well, this is scientific notation, so times 10 to the negative 20th. But these are actual numbers. Eventually, there will be a number. We're never at 100% confidence about this. So we don't ever want to say the p-value is actually zero, right? We're not 100% confident, but it can be less than 0.001. Is there a statistically significant difference? Yes, because p is less than 0.05, right? There is a statistically significant difference. P is less than 0.001, which is less than 0.05, right? That's the cutoff we use, the less than 0.05, which corresponds to over 95% confidence. And then I need to explain this in context. So I'm going to take my p-value is less than 0.001, which is the same as less than 0.1%. So I'm going to do 100% minus 0.1%. And that gives me 99.9%. Or I could do 1 minus 0.001. And that's going to give me 0.999. So, and then I would make that into 99.9% if I multiply that by 100. So I'm going to say if p equaled 0.001, I would say I am 99.9% confident. Because p was less than 0.001, I'm going to say I'm over 99.9% confident that, and then I'm basically, so I need to say, what does this mean regarding your null and alternative hypothesis? Because p is less than 0.05, I can reject my null and accept my alternative hypothesis. So for context, I already kind of wrote a contextual one right here. Again, this is just telling us that we're confident that the means are different, that the difference is more than zero. It's not telling us whether which one's more or less or anything else like that. We didn't test for that. We use the two-sided p. We're never using one-sided in this class. One-sided is where you're assuming a certain direction, like we're saying this one is bigger than that one, and we're only kind of testing in that direction. We're always using the two-sided p. And so when we're explaining, though, what this means, we don't want to say that we're not over 99.9% confident that one group has higher theistic beliefs or anything else like that. All this is testing for is whether the means are the same or not. So we rejected our null. So that means we're over 99% confident that non-Hispanic Black only US adults and US adults of a different race have different average theistic beliefs as of 2022. We could also look at these other ones. So let's see. That was the same. So here we can see our p-value is not less than 0.05. Here our sample sizes are still not the same. This is over 0.05. And so again, it says that you can use the first row if either you have sample sizes or if this is 0.05 or more. So we can use the first row, but you're also welcome to use the same. You'll see it doesn't change anything in terms of the significance here. They're both more than 0.05 and more than 0.1, so they're not marginally significant or significant. So based on our p-value, we're saying that we can't reject our null, right? That they could be the same. And in real life context, I'm saying I'm not over 95% confident that East North Central and West North Central US adults in 2022 had different average theistic beliefs. So they could be the same, even though in the sample they're a little different. Once we account for sampling error and look at kind of their confidence intervals, right, they would overlap. Here we can see for numbers of hours worked, again, neither of our p-values are less than 0.05. Sample sizes are different. This is more than 0.05. So I could use this first one if I wanted, but it doesn't matter. Again, I'm not confident. I'm not over 95% confident. I can't reject our null that these means are the same. And lastly, this one, again, nothing close to 0.05. So for race, I'm also not confident that they're different, right? They could be the same. Okay. Using the 95% confidence interval of the difference, how close together might the group's means be? Would you say it's substantive or not? So if I were to look at this, actually I want the whole thing. Okay, you can see here's the 95% confidence interval of the difference. So this is not the same as the confidence intervals we looked at last week. Because actually, right, we can have a confidence interval for this mean, right? If this was a 4.59, again, the confidence interval would probably look like something like, I don't know, 4.5 to 4.68 or 4 to 5 point whatever, right? These don't look like that, right? And so what are these numbers? So what they're doing is they're taking the means and we're saying, okay, if we take this mean and this sample mean and we subtract it, we get this. And actually I could have looked at that earlier if I wanted for how different are the sample means. This literally does the addition or subtraction for me. So they're 0.828 different. So this one is 0.83 lower than that one. Okay, so we know that the samples, right, the average among our respondents for the first racial and the second racial category are 0.83 different. And we're building a confidence interval around that. So we're saying, okay, in the sample, they're 0.83 different, but we need some wiggle room for sampling error. So it could be that this one is 0.8 less than that, but it could be that it's 0.996 less, or it could be that it's negative 0.66 less. So it could be anywhere from about 2/3 of a point to like a whole point lower. So we're saying this one's lower than that at the 95% confidence interval of the difference. But it's somewhere between, right, like 2/3 to 1 point different. So that's what this one is saying. So how close could they be? If this overlapped 0, meaning if this went from like a negative to a positive or a positive to a negative, that means they could be the same because it could be 0 different. This one doesn't. And so we're looking for the one that's closer to 0, right? That has a lower absolute value. And so we're saying that not non-Hispanic Black only are at least 0.66 lower than non-Hispanic Black only at the 95% confidence level. Is that substantive? So again, this is where you need to think about this yourself, right? So like for me on a 1 to 6 scale, 2/3 of a difference as an average seems pretty significant. That's like a 13% shift on the whole scale from the 1 to the 6. And that's also, I think, kind of qualitatively different to be over halfway different from one of these or crossing over the threshold. If this was like a 0 to 100 scale, like a feelings thermometer was 0.66 different, I'd say it's definitely not substantive, right? And so you have to evaluate it based upon context. So I'm going to say yes, but if you said no for this and you justify and you say, you know what, they're still both kind of within the same area, their theistic beliefs aren't that different, that's okay. So I'm saying that like both, it's a big difference on this scale since it's only 1 to 6, and then also that, like almost a 2/3 difference, which again, it could be more. We're saying at 95%, we're 95% confident at least a 2/3 difference, basically. Um, Means that because we're taking all the people in a group and averaging them, so like all non-Hispanic, Black only US adults or all folks of another racial category, there's either a good number of people who have kind of much higher theistic beliefs that bring that, or there's a good number of people that are just higher compared to some folks who are lower. Or there's a good number of people, right, in the not non-Hispanic Black that are lower that are, right, bringing down that average. But to get to that 2/3, right, there's something going on there that I think is meaningful and sizable enough. If I were to look at these other ones, okay, so here you can see that the difference between these was negative 0.28. So East North Central was zero point 0.2 lower on like less theistic beliefs on average than West North Central. But if we put the confidence interval around here, we're saying that we're 95% confident the East North Central is anywhere from half a unit lower to zero point 0.1 units higher. So this one you can see overlap 0. And so how similar could they be? They could be 0 units different. They could be the same, right? They might not be, we're 95% confident that they're at least 0 different, right? They could be the same. And so that's not substantive, right? And so anytime that you see a p-value that's more than 0.05, you should generally see this overlapping 0. We look at this next one, same thing, this overlaps 0, and this one overlaps 0. So none of these other ones, how close could they be? They could be 0 apart from one another, right? Again, they could be further. This could be 2.5 hours different, right? This one could be 4 and 3/10 different. This one could be half a point different, but we're not confident that it's there. Based on our data, we're confident that it's at least that it could be the same. And it could even be that this one's higher than that one, or this one's, or East North Central is higher, or East North Central is lower. We're not even sure which direction at 95% confidence. Okay. Last part of this, do you think there is a causal relationship? And even if like you'd say no based on one of these, I want you to just go through these as practice. Because if you have one that's like not significant, you're going to say no, but I still want you to think through these others. So for this, I'm saying, does these racial groupings have an impact on theism? And I'm going to say yes. I think it is causal. So significance, it was significant. I said that in number 5. I don't need to rewrite out just fine. Substantive, I argued it was substantive. If you said it wasn't substantive, then you're not going to argue it's causal. I mean, maybe it's having an impact, but it's just so small we don't care enough about it. But we're just going to say no. This is C number 6. Causal order. So this is saying, does how theistic somebody is, like the extent to which they believe in God, influence their racial identity? Or is it more likely that their racial identity might influence their theistic beliefs? And so theism is a belief. And so we often think about more stable demographics like gender or race as coming first. And then those social locations having an impact on socialization and culture and other things that then can impact things like ideology and beliefs. So the causal order would make sense here. Correct causal order. Race might impact theistic beliefs, but your theism doesn't change your race, right? So it's not that it's going the other way. Sometimes things can go in both directions, and so we have to think about kind of which is more impactful for this, right? So maybe which is having kind of more of an effect direction-wise. And this is a theory question. So significance and substance, this is stuff that, right, you're testing for, that we're looking at. But for this, you just have to use your brain and think about it. Theory. So if we want to argue it's causal, we have to have an argument about why. So it's not just something that like happened to relate, but we have to have an idea of how they relate. So I'm not asking you for this class to do any research or look at literature or anything else, but just to come up with something that sounds plausible in your mind of why we might be seeing this. And so, I mean, I know that in the United States, Black US Americans tend to be more religious and Christian than other other US Americans on average. And I don't know the history of why that is, but like the Black Church, for example, is a an important institution within the Black US American community. Obviously, there's Black people who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are secular atheists. Although Jewish and Muslim ones obviously could also have high theistic beliefs. But in general, this I know this, and so that and I'd say into that religious socialization and participation could lead to higher theistic beliefs with churches teaching that God exists. So that's my theory of why, if they're going to church more and more religious, part of religious communities more, they might be learning more that God is real versus other groups, if they're doing that less, might not be learning that or might not internalize that as much. And then we have non-spuriousness. So this is asking, is there anything else that might come before both race and theistic beliefs that might explain away the relationship? So like region, for example. So if there's a certain region that was there were certain regions that had higher Black populations and higher theism and certain regions that didn't, and you thought that region came kind of before race, you could say, oh, it might be spurious because actually the relationship is between region and theism, and race is part of what's kind of mediating, explaining some of what's going on there. If it's something that comes in between, like let's say church going, then that's something that just explains the relationship, but it doesn't explain it away, right? That explains the mechanism by which race is impacting theism. So if you have something like, if you start out with an independent variable that's kind of not something like race or gender, or I mean, age, you could think about something like generation or something, but like if you think about if you have an independent variable that starts a little bit further down with a belief or something else, it's easier to think of if there's something spurious. But for something like this, I can't think of a variable that would precede race that would explain away the relationship. And so I'm just going to write that. I can't think of a preceding variable that would explain away the relationship. Okay. Let's look at some of these others for causality. Well, all the others were not significant. So we would argue that they're not causal, right? They weren't significant or substantive. They need all of these. Causal order, I think is correct for all of them, right? Race could impact how many hours you work, but how many hours you work doesn't change your race. Region might impact your theistic beliefs or how many hours you work, but how many hours you work or your theistic beliefs is probably not going to change the region that you live in or the state you live in. Theoretically, we'd have to think about, oh, does this region have more manufacturing, or why might this region have higher, hours worked, or does this region more religious, right? What's going on that might cause this region to have higher or lower theistic beliefs? And then for non-spuriousness, let's say we had a relationship between region and theism. And let's say that the region that was more theistic is a region where, let's say we included like Utah, which has a high Mormon population. We might say, oh, like is it religion causing explaining the relationship? So is it that region impacts your religion, which impacts your theism, or is it that religion impacts your region of where you live, which impacts your theism? And since those are both kind of early ones, it's hard to kind of parse that out. But those are the types of questions you'll ask yourself for spuriousness. I can't think of any examples for any of these where I could argue that it was spurious. Um, but again, none of the other ones are causal because they're not significant, let alone substantive. So if there's no relationship, if we're not confident that there is a relationship, we're not going to argue that the independent variable is having an effect on the dependent variable, right? That those categories matter for influencing the variation in the dependent variable.